Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Mr. Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Sweet. Now, Game 3 of the NBA Finals has concluded. Friday, of course, after this episode, we'll have Game 4. But the Indiana Pacers pulling off a victory in Game 3, winning 116-107 to take a 2-1 lead. Only 2 more wins away from the NBA title, right? The championship is within grasp. Oklahoma City may be in trouble. We'll start off from the Indiana side. Obviously, the two big things here is one, great Tyrese Haliburton game, major bounce back performance, 22 points, 11 assists, 9 rebounds, 9 of 17 from the field, 4 of 8 from 3. And even though he was only a +1, you watched the game and you could tell he had a major imprint on this game. But not just on offense, right? Defensively too, right? 2 steals, a block, even beyond that, I'm sure a bunch of other deflections, a bunch of other possessions where Oklahoma City is targeting him defensively, and he's using his length, he's using his IQ to be able to not just get overwhelmed on the defensive end, right? He's really making a huge difference there. And for Indiana, really the story of this game was their defense. I mean, they held Oklahoma City to 107. They won the turnover battle, right? Indiana turned the ball over 13 times, right? Oklahoma City turned it over 17 times. I think the broadcast mentioned it was 19, so I guess it must have changed or updated since then. But either way, right, you got to win the turnover battle against Oklahoma City, right? Because remember, they take care of the ball and they force you to turn the ball over on the other end of the floor. And, you know, that was the big thing there, especially like in the final stretch of the game where Oklahoma City just could not score the basketball, right? Because this was an incredible back and forth game, especially in the first half, right? It was all about offense for the most part, right? It was like 64-60, best offensive half that we've seen so far. But then, when you got down to the nitty gritty of it, in the fourth quarter, I mean, Oklahoma City, scored like 5 points or so in the last, 7 points in the last 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah.
And, it was mostly on free throws, right? It was like, a couple of Caruso free throws, a couple of split pairs of free throws from like Cason Wallace and Jalen Williams. And, again, from the Indiana perspective, in addition to obviously the major bounce back game from Haliburton, right, on both ends of the floor, you also got some huge contributions from the bench, where you look at that second unit, you got Bennedict Mathurin and TJ McConnell in Indianapolis, right, at home. So this was kind of the argument that people made for the Pacers, was that at home, you'd get some big performances from guys that you didn't get the first couple of games. Bennedict Mathurin with 27 points off the bench, tied for third most points off the bench in an NBA Finals game. 27 points on 12 shots in 22 minutes, including 7 of 8 from the free throw line, 2 of 3 from 3, and all mostly within control and within the flow of the offense, because the big thing with him is he's been kind of up and down in the playoffs because he has these games where really good highs, but some really awful lows. But the thing that's always good is that, like, a lot of these big games are the ones where, like I said, it's all within the flow of the offense, where it doesn't feel out of place. He's not really monopolizing the ball too much. He's just taking what the defense gives him. And Oklahoma City hasn't really found like an obvious guy, outside of like a Lou Dort, that can really do much to slow him down. I mean, he was unconscious out there for the most part. And then you look at McConnell, right, with his 10 points, 5 assists, and also 5 steals, including like at least 2 or 3 inbound steals. There was a couple that just like four. Okay, so all but one were inbound steals. A couple of those, like if you're the Oklahoma City film people or the coaching staff, like those are some of those you got to pull your hair out, because there was like one in the fourth quarter where I think OKC had a lead and they had a pair of turnovers where it was like a Jalen Williams doubled, and then he's kind of forces the ball to SGA, and it's a turnover, and they go the other way and score. Then there was the awful Caruso inbounds pass where McConnell's literally standing there with his hands out, like basically just like looking to take the ball. He's right there. It's like a 2K steal, right? Where if you've ever played the game, you see how easy it is for like the computer or like for just anybody to get steals, where it's like the ball just magnetically goes into the player's hands. And That's huge, right? Because, and again, that's a part of the defensive identity that we've seen from the Pacers over the course of this season, where, in the beginning of the season, their defense was kind of like last year, where it wasn't really that great. And then from, January onwards, right, they were as good a basketball team as pretty much anybody, and a big part of that is the improvements they've made defensively. Then you look some of the other bench guys, Obi Toppin with 8 and 6. He had that massive putback dunk and a couple of decent defensive stops, although it wasn't great defensively, but just some big plays late in the game. Miles Turner was bad for most of this game, but he ended up having 5 blocks and had some really big key defensive plays late, right, on Chet Holmgren, where he had like back-to-back blocks. I think they had 5 blocks in like the last few minutes of the game, right?
Yeah.
Where just yeah, I mean, just a lot of great defensive plays. Pascal Siakam with 21 and 6. He was kind of the guy that they initially went to in the first quarter, where he scored the first few baskets for them, where he was kind of attacking mismatches, attacking SGA, posting up on him, fading over guys. And it was super impressive, right, from Indiana's perspective, because, you watch Oklahoma City this game, and, this was, like I said, a super back and forth game where in the first quarter, in Oklahoma City threw the first punch, right? I think they were up, like not 6-9 points early. And you're kind of thinking, all right, OKC is approaching this with the mindset of, if we can win this game, we can end the series probably. Because, I'd said on the podcast last time that if Oklahoma City won either game in Indiana, they probably win the series. But that was not the case. Like I said, from the first quarter onwards, right? Because Indiana pretty much kind of kept pace with them. They had the lead at halftime. OKC, it was funny because there was a stretch, and this was just, like I said, evident of it being such a back and forth game. There was a stretch at the end of the third where it was like a Jalen Williams pass to Chet and one dunk, and then he makes a three at the end of the quarter, and OKC is up 5. And I'm like, oh, wow, OKC might actually pull this out. And, it felt like neither team played well for different stretches of the game. But then in the fourth quarter, like I said, Oklahoma City offensively, it went back to kind of what we saw in game one, where it was not a lot of ball movement, a lot of forced shots, a lot of turnovers, although they didn't turn the ball over in the first game. But just the bad version of Oklahoma City offensively showed up. Chet, he had 20 and 10, but he was awful in the fourth
Oh my
quarter.
God.
I mean, he wasn't the only one, but just as a whole, it was rough because it kind of emphasize like, oh yeah, this is the bad version of OKC that we've seen, especially on the road, right? They're 500 on the road this postseason, right? I think they were 4-3 going into the game. Now they're 4-4. And now, right, it's funny because OKC, like I said, wins the game, probably ends the series. Not that it has to be 5, but just you would give OKC, the nod in terms of they're probably going to win. But now Indiana's up 2-1. Like I said, big props to them for all the different things that they did on both ends of the floor, right? And wearing OKC down, those guys were gassed at the end of the game. And, I know they can mention that they weren't, but just Indiana was just relentless over the course of the game and never let OKC off the hook at any point. And like I said, they were never out of it, which was also the key thing there. Just like I said, a lot of big contributions on both ends. Like Nembhard had 8 points, but he made some really timely buckets, and he was also a guy that was guarding SGA a decent amount of the game, right? Again, as we've talked about what Indiana does, picking up guys full court, harassing, being physical as well, because OKC had moments where they were being super physical, right? Where you could see the broadcast mention Jalen Williams and other guys kind of driving to the basket and kind of barreling into guys where the guys kind of look like that they're trying to draw a charge and they're kind of falling back and the refs weren't falling for it. And then, like I said, in the fourth quarter, that was shut down. And there were like a handful of possessions where you had guys for OKC sort of second guessing themselves. Even SGA, who wasn't great in this game, right? Where he had a couple of possessions where he kind of had a decent look, then he faked and passed it up, and then they didn't really get a good shot off. So now, unlike what you might have thought, where now this series has become super interesting. And, I think, we were hopeful that we would get a competitive series. Like I said, I had Oklahoma City in 6, but now Oklahoma City's in real danger where, now Friday game 4 becomes a must win where you're on the road against a team that's been extremely awesome at home and they're super confident. Clearly they believe that they can beat this team when, for whatever reason, a lot of analysts picked this to be like a super quick series, but Indiana has given them everything you could ask for. from them and then some. So now, like I said, Oklahoma City must win because, this is not a secret, obviously. If they lose the game, they go down 3-1 and it's over. So, and this is different from the Denver series because this Pacers team, even though you can make, they don't have a Jokic, they don't have a guy quite as good as him. They have a super balanced, very good team. And defensively, right? Like they've been able to do some of the stuff that Denver was kind of able to do, but better, right? They don't have to always rely on the zone, and they're deeper, right? Like Denver didn't have a guy off the bench that could give you 27 points in a road game, and Indiana does, right? And they got a lot of really good things going for them. So OKC, this is it. This is for all the marbles because you lose this game, series is over, and people are going to have some real conversations about Oklahoma City if they lose this series. I mean, obviously, yes, they're a young team. They can get better and improve, but, it would be a massive upset if Oklahoma City were to lose this series. I picked Oklahoma City to win. I picked them in 6, so I'm still going to stand by it. But, hey, this is a pretty precarious situation that Oklahoma City is involved in, and we're going to once again get to see if these guys are ready for the moment because – that was not a good showing for them in the fourth quarter in what could have been a really pivotal game for them. And now they're going to have to do that, but actually win it this time, or else, like I said, this is done.
Yeah, it's really unbelievable. I think that we're in this position. I don't know. For me, I think, the Thunder, they just didn't want it as much as Indiana, right? You could just tell the motor from Indiana was completely different. You kind of expect that at home, I guess, coming off of a loss, right? You could tell the effort was there. Like TJ McConnell was leaving it all out on the floor, Bennedict Mathurin, showing up in the way that he did, being the lead scorer for Indiana, that's huge, right? Like you're not going to get that every night. So they're really making the most of it. It was definitely a, team effort because Siakam gave you his usual. Tyrese Haliburton was very aggressive, posting nearly a triple-double. And like you said, defensively, they rattled the heck out of Oklahoma City, right? So you do have to credit, Indiana for everything that they've done throughout this postseason, and they continue to surprise me, really. And yeah, like I said, last episode, it really starts with Haliburton because if he's aggressive, that opens up opportunities not just for himself but for others as well. And I think the guys coming off of the bench and having the impact that they have, I think that's the huge X factor for this team, right? Because if the bench doesn't really show up, then you're really relying on Haliburton and Siakam, to kind of, I guess, outduel, the OKC stars. And, how likely is that going to be? Who knows, right? But the supporting cast for Indiana has been, kind of up and down, but the highs are super high for this squad, right? And you talked about it with McConnell, having the energy, having the steals, the inbound steals. I mean, those are crushing blows, right? Like you're watching that live and you're like, what are we doing, guys? It's so careless with the ball, right? And then from the Thunder perspective, very disappointed in the coaching, right? I thought they would potentially have an advantage, in that department. But throughout this series, I've been kind of disgusted with it, right? Because I don't know why you veered away from what worked throughout the majority of the regular season, right? I don't like starting Kassan Wallace, I think, over Hartenstein, not using the bigs and things like that. I think the rotations, those are weird as well. Seems like they pull guys when they're in rhythm for some reason, right? Because I think there was a stretch in this game where, Chet had like, I think it was like 12 points or 6 points in 12 minutes. I can't remember, but, and then you pull him and he doesn't get any shots. And then, when it's his time to show up, he can't, and he gets completely boxed, like you said, by Miles Turner and back-to-back blocks and just having one of the worst, I think, possessions in clutch time that I think I've ever seen in the playoffs, right? So, and it's tough to be inserted back in and to find your rhythm again. Like even a guy like Isaiah Joe, he sparked 2 threes and then was pulled. Like for what? I thought he could find some rhythm and give you, a little bit of life, but I don't know. I've been thoroughly disappointed in the coaching, but very impressed with the coaching from Rick Carlisle. And he's been here before. He's been on the stage before, right? He's a championship coach. Definitely one of the more underrated guys in terms of playoff success and playoff wins. Everybody knows, if you know ball, then you know that he's a sleeper pick, I think, for being a pretty good coach in the playoffs. But, he trusts his guys. They kind of stick to their guns. If the guys are having an off night, they're still going to play, right? They don't really scrape for answers, right? And I think, the Mathurin game is a perfect example, right? Because he hasn't been, too phenomenal, throughout the postseason, but he's been showing up recently. And I think that's the cool part on both ends of the floor, right? And being that spark plug at home, I think that was the biggest X factor, right? Because if he has somewhat of a mediocre game, Oklahoma City maybe squeezes by. And I think, or at least, maybe it's like a closer margin of victory, but Mathurin having a game like that and then the defense showing up and just the overall effort from Indiana, you have to tip your hat to them.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because Carlisle, he made this decision in the fourth quarter where there was this stretch where Siakam was, even though he was playing well, he wasn't even in the game. Like there was a long stretch where, it was the other front court guys out there, and Indiana was able to hold on and was able to continue to play really well. And it's funny with Oklahoma City, right, where this is kind of one of the questions about, and this is one of the X factors, like you mentioned with the bench, because Oklahoma City, a lot of the guys that showed up, say like you had a huge game from Caruso and Wiggins in game 2, right, where they both had 20 points and outscored everybody on the Pacers. But then, in this game, you didn't really get that. I mean, Caruso was, okay in terms of, he was, at 8 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals. But just as a whole, nobody off the bench really gave them enough. And obviously you mentioned you got the 2 Isaiah Joe threes and, not much else. But that's, you're going to have somebody for Oklahoma City to come off, to come off the bench and do that. And that's kind of one of the concerns that people had going into the playoffs with Oklahoma City is, hey, like they didn't make a trade at the deadline where they don't have a guy off the bench that you can just turn to for, some
Instant
off
offense,
night
yeah.
creation or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Just some additional scoring punch. Whereas, with Indiana, like you said, and like I mentioned, right, you got like a guy in Mathurin who has been pretty up and down, right? But when he's on, right, he can have a game like this where, again, a huge finals game where he's the leading scorer, right? Because actually, I think no one else has scored more than him for the Pacers in this finals game than he did, right? He had 27, and after that, right, Haliburton and Siakam have been somewhere around 20. For the first 2 games. Right? I think Haliburton had 14 in game 1, 17 in game 2. And then Siakam had like 19 in game 1 and then like I don't know, 14, 15, 16 or something in game 2, right? Cuz it was mostly from the free throw line. But just as a whole, who's that going to come from Oklahoma City, right? Cuz most of those guys are primarily specialists and it's tough, but I think for the thing that you got to admit with the Pacers is like they're just a way better team clearly than I think most people have given them credit for, right? Because like by and large they have not been favored in any of these series outside of the first round matchup against the Bucks, right? And they've been able to take all of them out, right? And a big part of that is what they can do, like I said, on both ends of the floor, combined with the depth. Even though they don't have that traditional, like 25, 30 point per game score, they just have a lot of guys, and Haliburton is the head of the snake. He's the engine for this team. And the nice thing about him is, even in games where he has huge scoring games, it doesn't really change his passing or playmaking at all. He's still looking to get guys involved. Naturally, he's going to be taking more shots, and that's going to, involve like some possessions where he's just trying to keep himself involved. But, how many times will you see a game where he's got 20 plus points, but then only has like, 3, 4 assists, right? Unless it's a game where nobody's hitting shots, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a big part of what they're going to do. And I mentioned right at the end of game 2, right, that when Haliburton was on the floor, they were a net positive, whereas they were like nearly 20 points negative when he was off the floor, right? Because their bench was bad, right? So, and obviously in this one, completely flipped, right? Because the bench guys, most of them, aside from a couple of guys, were all double digits in terms of plus minus. And again, we know plus minus can be a flawed stat because, again, I don't think you would make the case that Haliburton, was only a barely net positive for Indiana, right? He was a +1, right? In a game that Indiana won by, 9 points. But either way, for Indiana, that's when they're their most dangerous. So, I mean, I guess the question is, if from an Oklahoma City perspective, what can you do to bounce back, in game 4? Because you're going to have to pull out all the stops now, right? Because this is, game 3, you could say it's not a must win, but, initially it felt like they were approaching it that way. But this one is an absolute must win, right? Where, again, you cannot lose this game on the road. This is going to be the toughest game all season, even more so than, I mean, the other ones weren't easy either, right? Like when they were down to the Nuggets, but just, now you're at the last level. You're in the finals where you have to win 3 out of the next 4 games, including at least one in Indiana. So from an Oklahoma City perspective, like I said, what do you think they can do, or what should they do to be able to, pull off, the win? Because again, this is for all the marbles right here. And it's weird because, like, even when you look at a lot of the guys' stats, right? I don't think you could really say anybody for Oklahoma City played great, right? Like, even like a Jalen Williams who had 26, 6, and 3. He had his moments. But then you look around, SGA 24, 8, and 4, right? With 3 blocks, but 6 turnovers, right? That's a problem. And then, Chet, like I said, 20 and 10, but 6 for 15. And then in the fourth quarter, he was a mess. So, what adjustments can you make if you're Oklahoma City? Because you got to do something.
Yeah. I think,
Especially offensively, I think.
yeah, offensively is where I think you do kind of scratch your head, right? But, I think don't play small ball, right? I don't know why they continue to try and do that. It didn't work in game 1. We saw the result of that. Granted, much closer and much more down to the wire, but I would kind of revert back to that normal starting lineup that you run. Your specific identity, the identity that got you here. Play the double bigs, right? I'm sure there's a way that you can find, to find a way to figure out the trade-offs and balance those things, right? Because that if you do bring out the double big, Indiana's going to try and take advantage of that, but you can take advantage of, their lack of size as well, right? There's ways around that, and I think they've done that all year, so why start switching it up now? I think Shea needs to be better, right? I think when he has lackluster performances, especially when he does turn the ball over, that kind of has a trickle down effect because it puts a lot of pressure on guys like, Chet and J-Dub to, show up. But in this game, the inconsistencies were a little bit too much. I think, Chet and J-Dub also need to stop, pooping the bed, right? That doesn't help. So I think there's a level of inconsistency here. And it's kind of been prevalent throughout the entire postseason, right? I feel like this team is under a big magnifying glass whenever they lose, right? Everyone wants to dissect them. People want to call them overrated, garbage, whatever the case may be. But when they do win, it's normally by a large margin and also very dominantly, right? So I think they do need to kind of revert back to what their identity is. So I'm not super worried yet. I think if they lose the next game, then I'll be like, yeah, Oklahoma City's cooked. But in terms of adjustments, I think they need to play big and not play down to the competition because that's what it feels like right now.
It's funny because, going into the fourth quarter when they had the 5-point lead, like you had a situation where, like, they ended up winning the rebounding battle in this game by 6. Maybe the fourth quarter skews that a little bit, right? In the fourth quarter, Oklahoma City had 7 rebounds and the Pacers had 10, right? And again, the fourth quarter was the pivotal one because OKC went into the fourth quarter up, right? And then they ended up losing the game. And it's funny because, like I said, going into that quarter, you had like kind of a mediocre, middling SGA game, right? You had like a solid Jalen Williams game, right? Where I think he had like 20 or so points going into the fourth quarter and had, like I said, that big stretch at the end of the third that I thought kind of may have sealed the game for Oklahoma City. But then, like I said, in the fourth quarter, 18 points, 6 for 17 from the field, 0 of 4 from 3, 6 of 10 from the free throw line, and then 5 turnovers. So that's really the difference right there. And then you look at the Pacers in the fourth quarter, 32 points, 4 turnovers. So the turnover battle is about the same. But remember, Oklahoma City started the fourth with like a 5-point lead, and it was immediately whittled down like in the first minute or so because of the turnovers. And then Indiana shot 60% from the field in the fourth quarter, 13 of 21. And again, some big buckets from, Mathurin and McConnell to begin the fourth quarter. And that was really the difference right there. And that's where you lost the game is, like I said, the early portion of the fourth quarter where the Pacers were able to, like I said, get some stops, then turn them into buckets. And that's the game. And like you said, Oklahoma City usually when we've seen it this season, including the regular season, right, where a lot of their losses tended to be in these wire to wire, or not wire to wire, in these back and forth super close games where they come down to the last, X amount of possessions, right? That's where they tend to be at their worst. Whereas, like you said, they're kind of a front running team, not like front running in a bad way, but front running as in, they're at their best when they have when they're able to kind of play ahead and play relatively comfortably when they have a decent lead to play with. But, again, they have not really been able to pull away from Indiana too much aside from game 2. So I don't know if you really can necessarily expect that one. I mean, I expected game 3 to be a back and forth game. I just thought Oklahoma City might come out with the win. Again, I had Oklahoma City in 6, so I figured we'd probably have a split going back to OKC. But, I think OKC if you can get the next one, I think they will win the series. It's just a matter of, again, are we going to get that? Because, like I said, you're going to have better performances from some of these guys. I mean, their 3 best players were a combined 3 for 13 in the fourth quarter. And like I said, a big part of that was Indiana's defense.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to figure out, or they're going to have to figure out, some adjustments to make, especially in that mix. Because I thought they, even though they didn't even play well, I thought through the first 3 quarters either, right? Like, like they were up, but it was like, I'm kind of surprised that they're up with as poorly as they played, because Indiana was up too at different points. So we'll see. Yeah, hopefully game 4 is another battle, right? But again, if you're OKC, you don't really want to be in a battle.
No.
You're going to have to probably take this one by force. But
I think Shea drops 40, man. I think he's due for a explosion.
Yeah, so and I guess that's the question, is like, who can we expect to have a big game, because it felt like you were trending towards like, okay, this is a good Jalen Williams game where, like game 2 he was better, but in this game, right, he was really good, not just in terms of scoring but the floor game as well. So like, can you continue to get that, and can you get, like I said, Chet was fine through the first stretch of the game, and then fourth quarter just completely fell apart. And that's where I just kind of wonder, hey, what are you guys gonna do here? Because you have a series that you got to win at this point. But like I said, shout out to Indiana, because, again, they were very much underdogs to win this series, right? Like, I know that there were some people who wanted to, kind of be contrarians and pick them to win the series. But most people picked Oklahoma City to win the series. And most people also especially picked it to be, a 4 or 5 game series. Now, well, if OKC wins it, now it can't be 5. It has to be, at best, a 6-game series. Like I said, where they're going to have to win 3 out of the next 4 games. And I guess the question is how confident do we feel at this point, from an Oklahoma City perspective? Because I know you said that you're not worried really necessarily yet, but like, do you have like a percentage level of confidence that you got right now? Would it be above 50?
Yeah, it's above 50 for me. I would say it's about like 75. Seen this team in this position before. It's not like they haven't been down in a series, right? And like I said, they're one of the best responsive teams in the league right now, right? And I think they're built for the moment. I think they have tons of firepower. I think, Shea is the best player in the series, and he needs to play like it in this next game. And I think if they win this game, if they take one in Indiana and go back to Oklahoma City, that's where I think the momentum is going to shift back into their favor, because I don't expect Indiana to win another one in Oklahoma City.
Then I guess, bless you, now I guess just because we might as well just kind of entertain the hypothetical. Let's say Oklahoma City loses game 4, and then let's say, whatever happens. Maybe they win game 5, and then, it goes 6, and then they lose. What do you think? What if they lose this series? What would you say?
I'd be probably the lowest on this team ever. I would never really take them seriously again. I would say they need more experience, but how much more experience can you have, after getting to the finals and being, the utmost favorite and losing, right? It would feel like, a shell shock situation, I guess, kind of similar to, the previous iteration of a big 3 that we've seen in Oklahoma City. Like, do they break up the band after that? It wouldn't surprise me if they do, because you got to commit a lot of money to these guys, eventually. And and you still have other young guys that you need to pay as well. So, do they make an off-season move? But my opinion on that team would probably change drastically, right? I'd still be a avid, Shea supporter, but I would also say to myself, well, this team doesn't have what it takes because in the biggest moment they crumbled. And I think that's the unfortunate part because they're so stacked on both ends of the floor that there's really no excuse for them to lose this series, and you have to tip your hat to Indiana because my God, they've been playing, some beautiful basketball throughout the postseason.
Yeah, my guess would be that they would probably still end up running it back, and maybe they just kind of, do whatever they do with, the other incoming guys onto the roster. I don't think that they would necessarily shake it up. But like you said, it would definitely be a major upset, massive disappointment.
Yeah.
To say the least, right? Now, obviously for the Pacers, it would turn into, like one of the all-time underdog titles. Of course, if it happens, it happens, and we'll talk even more about it. But, game 4, I guess, what do you expect for game 4, right? Do you expect, because we're picking Oklahoma City to win the series, so I think we both have to kind of anticipate that they win this game. But I guess the question is, do we expect more of a game 2 outing, or are we expecting more of a game 3 outing where it's a back and forth and Oklahoma City's going to have to pull it out of the mud and win a tough one in Indiana in order to keep the series alive? What do you expect?
It could be either one, right? I know it might sound like a cop out. I really don't want to commit to either of those. I will commit to the fact that Oklahoma City
Game
wins the
by
game.
game is tough.
Yeah, I will commit to the fact that Oklahoma City will win the game. I don't know how it's going to go, how it's going to be, but I will say I think Shea is going to pop off. I think defensively they're going to game plan a lot better for Haliburton. And I also don't think that Indiana is going to have, a stellar bench performance like they did, in the last game, right? I don't think there's going to be a guy that pops off for 20 off the bench. You might get 20 combined from the bench, but not 20 from one guy. And I think that's going to be a huge difference maker. I think, considering I think that Shea is going to pop off and somebody else on Oklahoma City will as well. And I think defensively they're going to be a lot better. And, offensively they're going to take care of the ball. I just don't expect them to have back-to-back stinkers. That's not normally the pattern with that team, right? They'll have a stinker, they respond, and then, either they continue with that good momentum or they kind of fall back into the stinker, but they never really have back-to-back stinkers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just go with, I think game 4, maybe another closer, game where like maybe it's not like this, where it's like literally like 2-3 points apart. It could be like OKC is like up between like, I don't know, 8-13, and then
Okay.
Indiana could get it close to like 5-4, but maybe not much closer than that. Like you said, and game to game is tough, and that's why it's kind of tough to commit to what your expectation will be. But I think OKC, I agree. I think they will respond, and I think that we'll get a much better performance from them in the fourth quarter, regardless of what happens. In terms of like whether or not they have a big lead or a small lead going into the fourth quarter. But that's got to be the area of concern for them. It's just because the fourth quarters has been where they have been at their worst,
Yeah.
right, by and large. Because the fourth quarter cost them in game 1, and it cost them in this game. But either way, like you said, I expect them to win this game. But we'll see. Because again, Indiana has surprised us time and time again, and they continue to do so. So we'll see what happens. But again, great series thus far, I would say, regardless of what happens. And I think it's kind of a nice change of pace, right? Because I mean, obviously we've had 2-1 series leads before, right? Like the Heat Nuggets, right? The Nuggets won game 1, Heat won game 2, Nuggets won game 3, but it never felt like the Heat could actually win that series, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember if we said it would be a 5-game series or not, but I think we all expected Denver to win that series, right? We picked Boston last year in 6. They went up 3-0, and then, they ended up winning it in 5. But, this one is just funny, right? Because like I mentioned, going in, most analysts, right, expected this to be a quick series in favor of Oklahoma City, and it's not been the case. And the games, outside of game 2 have been really good.
Yeah.
I would say. So this is definitely, I would say, been the best finals in the last few years, right? I mean, I guess, the last 2, I think, were kind of mediocre whatever you want to call it. And then, what was it, 22? That was Warriors Celtics. That one was a good one. And then Bucks Suns. That was a really good one. So, I mean, we've had like a couple of weak finals performances. I don't know if I would call this like the flat out best one in the last 15 years, but it's definitely up there because, again, the underdog is up in the series right now. Like I said, regardless of what happens, they gave it a fight, because even if they lose a series, they took two, and so if you can win two, you're pretty close. So we'll see what happens. But OKC, let's see what they're made of. Let's see if they can pull off a Game 4 victory and get this back to Oklahoma City's with the game tied, and we'll go from there.
Yep.
Because again, like, this is the type of stuff that is going to kind of define what I think a lot of people will view OKC as going forward.
Yeah, what a banger.
Yeah, so now we'll move on just to a couple of housekeeping things, I guess. So now the New York Knicks have contacted 4, 5 different coaches,
Yeah.
and they have all been coaches that are currently coaches of other teams, right? Including, right, Jason Kidd of the Dallas Mavericks. They also contacted what was it? Excuse me. They also contacted, I think it was Quinn Snyder for the Atlanta Hawks.
Mm-hmm.
They also contacted Ime Udoka, right, from the Houston Rockets. The other day, they had just randomly mentioned that they had contacted, I think it was Billy Donovan, for the Chicago Bulls, right? And I think there may have been one other guy, maybe off the top of my head. And then they had just mentioned today that they had also contacted it, or they're thinking about maybe a couple of other coaches that are not employed right now, right? Where it's Mike Brown, right, who coached the Kings earlier this season, and then Taylor Jenkins, right, who coached the Grizzlies. So it's been kind of a barn burner in terms of what the Knicks are trying to do here. It's been, a lot of different things, to say the least.
Yeah, I don't really understand the logic. Normally when you do part ways with the head coach, you kind of do have, some sort of, I guess, contingency plan, right? And it seems like they're really kind of just scraping for answers. And I don't know why they thought that they could poach, some of these guys. And it's just funny how, the reports have been coming out. It's like they were firmly denied. They were immediately denied, obviously. Of course they would be. Like, why would a team just automatically, give that coach an opportunity to talk elsewhere, especially if it's a okay situation for both ends. So I don't know what New York's doing.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to who they hire, because initially it kind of felt like that they were veering towards like, oh, well, let's see if we can get Jason Kidd, and we'll see what happens there. But just kind of a funny story, in my opinion, just because, again, it just kind of feels like, I don't know. It just kind of feels like they're just kind of throwing whatever at the wall to see if it sticks. And, then there was even stuff about like other not random, but like other people like that were like, no, I'm not taking the Knicks coaching job. Where, what was it? It was like Jay Wright, who used to coach Villanova, and then Calipari, I think, right, who's coaching St. John's.
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
It's a lot of different things going on. But like I said, I'm still very curious as to who they hire. Who's gonna move on to the coach the next era of New York Knicks basketball. Regardless, it'll be fun.
Yeah, we'll see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then moving on, Shams Charania, right, has put out some more stuff about Kevin Durant, right? Where now there's a lot more talks and a lot more discussions about a lot of the specific teams that want Kevin Durant, right? Where they mentioned, I believe, his business partner, right, Rich Kleiman, as well as the Suns. They're all working together to find a spot to send him, because obviously the Suns seems like they're ready to kind of move on. I mean, both sides are ready to move on from one another. And he mentioned multiple teams, including the New York Knicks, the Houston Rockets, the Spurs, the Heat, and the Timberwolves, as well as several wild card suitors, right? Now, there were a couple of guys, I think, who covered specific teams, right? Barry Jackson and Anthony Chiang of the Miami Herald. They reported that the Heat are only interested in Durant at the right price. That's kind of my guess for the most part anyways, right? Like, say if you're the Spurs, as we've already talked about, you probably don't want to give up the number 2 pick to get, and try to get KD, but you might be willing to part with like the 14th pick, right? Which they also have. And then, obviously some of the other teams don't have, like the Knicks, I don't think have a ton of picks. They have mostly players. Minnesota's got some players. It's just a matter of how willing are they to move, some of those guys. And then, obviously the Heat, are in a different spot altogether. And then you got Houston, right, who's got a combination of players and picks. So we've talked about that, the other day, and you mentioned like, which team you'd kind of like. Are you willing to make a prediction as to where he goes?
Yeah, it's tough. There's a lot of options, right? It could be a curveball. It could be, one of the
Right.
teams that's been, in the mix, since
Yeah.
they had a horrible season, right? Like
Mhm.
Houston would really intrigue me a lot. Um, San Antonio, that would be cool, to kind of accelerate, the timeline for, Wemby's development and getting him into the playoffs and stuff like that. I would hate Miami as a KD fan. That would be probably my least favorite destination. And it's nothing against, the team. I just think that market is like a little bit too much pressure. I think, they're going to want to deliver a championship, and I don't think they could build a roster around him immediately, day one, him being there. Minnesota, that has some steam behind it. That definitely intrigues me. And New York is weird because I don't know what New York would give up and how the roster would look if KD does eventually go there. So I would probably say Houston or Minnesota would be probably the top two for me.
And then I guess the other question, might as well entertain it, is they mentioned that there were several wild card teams
Mm-hmm.
or suitors that could be interested in him. So I guess the other question that it could kind of be a fun exercise is like, what wild card teams could we be thinking of in regards to a team that comes out of nowhere? I have like a couple that have come to mind. Like this first one I had heard, right, from some reporting from some guys that cover the league. Some people have mentioned Cleveland. But just as some other wild cards, like what about like a Philadelphia? Could they possibly put together a package? Could they get off somebody's contract? I don't know.
I've heard that one.
But
Yeah, like with the number 3 pick, Paul
right,
George, something else. I mean, that
yeah,
might
not,
that might be
not the,
serviceable.
right, or Zach Lowe, I think on his podcast, he even mentioned like the Clippers
Yeah,
as a potential
you want to
destination.
you want to know who I would say?
What?
Sleeper, Detroit, because I
Yeah,
think
that's another one
I
that I've
think
heard.
I think they're interesting because I don't think they're going to be as good next year because they're not going to be able to keep everybody, right? So I think,
Okay.
you can build a package, I think in terms of, maybe mortgaging a little bit of the future and also giving, some young players up to the point where I think you feel pretty good, about bringing in, some real legit superstar help for Cade because I think that's what he needs at this point in his career.
Yeah, and like those guys, I'm sure could play together because we talked
Right.
about he's a pretty malleable guy,
Right.
Durant,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So I think he could fit in, to a lot of those different situations, and yeah, so that's where, like I said, I think I'd be really curious to see like what those wild card teams are because those seem like the ones that would be the most like. People have mentioned Toronto. I don't see that one. I just think that would just be like, kind of like you said, sort of like a Miami-esque situation where it's like, yeah, you got a really good player, but I don't feel like that you have really a core where you can just kind of swap some guys for Durant and say, all right, now we're a real contender. I mean, you could make the case, all right, you're in the East, right? So like because you're in the East, you can make some magic happen. But I don't know. That I don't see Toronto really doing that. I feel like you and I said, I think that those other teams, like I would think Detroit would be way more likely than like a Toronto, but I don't know if Detroit would necessarily do that either. It kind of comes down to that package, right? Like, the package because they got a few expiring guys that like if you wanted to throw them into the deal, like you could get the money, but they're going to be free agents. Like Hardaway's going to be a free agent, Schroeder's going to be a free agent, Beasley I think is a free agent as well. So like you said, then that means that you'd have to throw some of those young guys in there, right? Like maybe, and I think the Suns have mentioned that they would like to have a center back, which is interesting considering they have Nick Richards. Although I guess you wouldn't be 100% like, yeah, Nick Richards is our center of the future, but
yeah.
unless it's Duran, right? There'd be no one else on Detroit where you're like, this is our center of the future. But I guess you could say you have a starter and a backup. Like maybe you have like Isaiah Stewart, Tobias Harris, that could get you to what, like about 40 or so. Then I think you'd have to probably add a couple other contracts in there and see what happens and see what you can work with there. So that might be able to get it done, but I just don't know, like I said, what the package would be. But like I said, some of those teams make sense, but I feel like the most likely ones would be probably the main ones that they mentioned. I feel like the wild card ones, like they're wild cards for a reason, but it's always a fun exercise, I would say, but it feels like at this point, definitely a guarantee that he gets moved. It's just a matter of when, and it's a matter of where.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, I guess we'll close it out, and we'll read a comment that we got on our last short, and this was from our Oklahoma City Takes Game 2 short, and the person actually commented the other day after Indiana's Game 3 win, here after 2-1 Pacers. So, they came in, and they're kind of pointing out the fact that, I guess in the short, we kind of both mentioned, like, all right, Oklahoma City won Game 2. This is the version of the team we expected to see. Now we might see this for the rest of the series, and we did not get that in Game 3.
Yeah, OKC stunk it up. And you credit Indiana. They're taking the lead, and I think that's best case scenario for them.
Yeah, and now in our last poll, right, we asked the question of will OKC win the series? And it was funny because at that point, the answer was we put yes in 5, yes in 6, yes in 7. Well, yes in 5 can't be an option now, right? And actually, and most responses actually said yes in a yes in 6. So
Okay, fair.
well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, if you want to join in on these polls, just go to our Instagram at the OBT Podcast. Obviously, you can also leave a comment on our shorts and our videos. And if you do that, or if you leave it on our IG or our Twitter or TikTok, we'll read the comment. We'll pick one and read it. And then also continue to like and subscribe, help the channel grow. We've already passed our goal of 200. Let's get to 500. We appreciate all the support. We'll see if we might be able to live stream after Game 4. We'll see what happens. And if we do, obviously join that, hang out and talk to us. And if not, we'll see you in the next episode.